Welcome to TheGig. I'm Johnny O, and today we're talking about VMware. Well, not just VMware, just virtualization. The most popular software application for this is VMware. The reason they're the most popular is they were the first, and as far as software is concerned, they are the best. I've used them all. VMware is the best virtualization. You know, someone who's not exactly computer savvy can use VMware. Then get it up and running. It's very easy to understand. I'm just going to explain how it works today. Now, when you have a machine, let's take a typical machine. It runs at 3 gigahertz. You have 16 gigabytes of RAM and say a couple terabytes in storage. And you're running Windows 10. And you want to run Linux or possibly even OS X. Although I don't advise running OS X because it sucks. So if you're going to run Linux, don't run OS X. Run actual Linux. Run Ubuntu or something like that. Ubuntu is a version of Linux that has a very nice GUI, a very nice user interface. Not as nice as Windows, and it doesn't run the same as Windows. It is Linux, but it is very nice. Or if you're on a Linux machine, a lot of programmers I know really like Linux, and they have the engineering skills to run Linux as a regular desktop operating system. But for some things, they want to use Windows. So what they do on the typical computer that I described, 3 gigahertz CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and a couple terabytes of storage, they'll take VMware, and there is consumer and enterprise versions of VMware. They'll take VMware and they'll install it on their computer. And what that will allow them to do is run a virtual machine inside the operating system that they have. So if it's Linux or if it's Windows, if it's Linux and you want to run Windows, or if you're in Windows and you want to run Linux, or if you're in Windows and you want to run server, Windows Server. I've done that a lot. Or SQL, you can do that with a pretty big machine. So when you set it up, it'll say how much CPU do you want to dedicate to this virtual machine. So maybe out of 3 gigahertz, you want to take 1 gigahertz or 1.5 gigahertz, half your CPU power. You want to take half your RAM, maybe. Okay? Maybe out of your 16 gigabytes of RAM, you want to take 8 gigabytes of RAM. Just for that virtual machine. And you have 2 terabytes of storage, maybe you want to take 1 terabyte of storage and put it on that VM. And so you'll have 2 machines you're running. One of them will be, say, running Linux with half your resources, and the other one will be running Windows with the other half of your resources. It'll take half your CPU cycles, it will take half your RAM, and it will take half your storage space. So in that, you don't have to, we used to do this dual booting or multi-booting, where we would boot into whatever operating system we wanted. I remember back, 15 years ago, booting into Windows XP, and then I'd have Windows 95, and I might even have, back then, I might even have a version of Server that I would boot into, but I would have to reboot my machine and boot into that operating system, that specific version of an operating system for troubleshooting or something like this. Usually it was for troubleshooting. Now they have VMware. VMware started getting popular in about 2007, 2008. By 2010, it took off and kind of rules the roost as far as virtualization software. I'm not sure who owns it now. I could have looked it up, but I didn't. I believe it's HP. It's been sold a few times. It was independent, then it got bought, and then it got sold. I think EMC owned it, then they sold it to HP, something like that. But it runs as an independent company, even though it's owned by, say, HP or these other companies. They still have their own group of people that work within VMware. And it's not part of, say, HP, even when it's owned by HP. HP will have that resource, and they can do whatever they want with it. But the VMware and the VMware company and team, they kind of work together. So you do have a dedicated VMware team, regardless of who owns the company. It is the #1. Now, the reason virtualization is so important is there's a lot of cloud services that I've mentioned on previous videos, like Azure and Amazon. Now by I think 18 or 19, most hosting is going to be on either Amazon or Microsoft Azure. And how they accomplish that is you don't have to deploy hardware anymore. As I explained in the other video, you go into your configurator, which is a web page where you configure your computer or your machine on Azure or Amazon according to the specs. So if you want a server that runs 4 CPUs at 4 gigahertz or 3 gigahertz, so you can have 4 CPUs, you want 32 gigs of RAM or 64 gigs of RAM. I think the minimum is 4 gigs. 4 gigs of RAM, so you have to start at 4 and work up from there. And you can go absolutely massive. You can go up to multiple terabytes of RAM if you really want. It would be expensive, but what they're doing there is they're taking virtualization and they're making the configuration for the virtualization a web page. And the virtualization software that they use is running in the background, and that's what they're using to configure your machine to your specifications. It's simply a virtualization application running in the back that configures your server the way you want. The amount of RAM you want, the amount of CPU power you want, the amount of storage space you want, and they come preloaded usually with operating systems. So it's even more convenient because if you have a VMware machine, if you've ever loaded Windows or Linux onto your own machine, when you start up a virtual machine and you allocated the resources to this VM, you have to load Windows onto that VM as if you were loading it onto your hardware. It's virtualized. So in the same sense, you have to do that with Azure. But you can get a blank machine. No one does that. You'll get a configuration, say, for a 3 gigahertz CPU. You can choose the cores, 2 cores, 3 cores, 4 cores, 5 cores, the amount of RAM, and then what it will do, it will have a drop down, and you can choose your operating system. There's several versions of Linux you can choose. There might even be, I've seen it once or twice, 1 or 2 versions of Unix on Azure that you can also choose. Then you'll have all the Windows Server operating systems. You can choose those as well. Now, I don't remember a desktop operating system being available, but I'm sure it is. I'm not 100% positive. I'm pretty sure you can grab Windows 10 on a virtual machine on Azure. All Azure and Amazon are virtual machines. You're renting a virtual machine online, just as if you were to run VMware on your desktop computer and configure a separate computer with separate resources and a separate operating system. But in this case, you have to load it yourself. With Azure and Amazon, it's virtualization. So IDC space has become virtualized. They use that word virtual in IT a lot. Virtual means logical. In configurations and in IT, we use the word logical. For example, a logical network would be a LAN. Okay, that's logical, which means I can take any computer and give it the same IP and subnet, and it will be able to see all the other nodes on that LAN. That's a logical configuration. It's not a physical configuration. Now, if I take a VLAN, a virtual local area network, I know it's counterintuitive, but that's a physical network. Okay? We separate the networks with VLANs, virtual. They're actually not just logical, they're also physical, whereas a LAN is a logical organization of computers on a network, where a physical configuration would be a different switch, a different IP, something like that. So in Windows, you'll notice you have a printer, a printing device, maybe it's a laser jet or something like that, and then there's a piece of software that runs that printer. And that's what Windows calls the printer. The printer is logical. It's a piece of software configuration within Control Panel that Windows considers your printer. Now, when you go to choose a printing device, it makes that distinction between physical and logical. So we'll ask you, what printing device do you want to configure? Maybe it's this HP printer or something like that. So that's your physical printer. They call it printing device. The logical printer within Windows is the logical printer. They just call it the printer. It's a piece of configuration within control panel. So that's what you find in IT. They distinct between physical and logical. So a physical network would be everything, say, on the same VLAN. Logical network would be the same network, but with everything connected with the same IP. That makes a logical network. Okay, if you make a physical network, you use a different switch and this sort of thing. That would be a separate physical network. Okay, we call that a physical network and a logical network. VMware works the exact same way. You have a physical machine. It could be a Dell or something you've built, and you have a virtual machine inside that, a logical machine. It doesn't exist in hardware. It only exists in virtual reality or virtual space, cyberspace. It doesn't exist physically. So when you go into Azure or Amazon, you're simply renting a virtual machine, a virtual server, a very good virtual server, because you could have multiple CPUs, dozens and dozens, and terabytes of RAM, and hundreds of terabytes of hard drive space. Theoretically, if you want, if you have the money to do that, you could configure massive servers in these systems. You'll pay for them, but all you're doing is you're renting a virtual server. Now, if you're an engineer and you want to work within multiple operating systems, guaranteed you use VMware on your desktop. Now, the virtual machines are online. It's called Azure and Amazon. You rent a virtual machine online. That's how everybody's doing it now. They're not deploying their own hardware. They're using VMs. They call them VMs. VMware is a company with their own application called VMware, but they're all VMs. Microsoft will have their own version that they built does the same thing as VMware, and I think there'll be a few others. I'm not sure the names of the most popular is VMware. I don't even know, and I don't think Microsoft runs VMware on Azure. They'll have their own software that they run that configures that virtual machine for you. Subscriptions down below, arguments down below, questions, comments. I'll get to your questions, I'll get to your comments if I like them. If I don't, forget it. I'll just ignore you.